I'm going to show you how to create a negligent discharge with a Remington Model 700 trigger. We have a view window here that shows how much sear engagement. Right now, the sear is sitting on top of the trigger. Pull the trigger. The trigger moves forward. The sear drops down, releasing the striker. Cock it. The sear goes up. Close the bolt. Sear comes down. Before adjusting the screws, you need to remove the glue that Remington put there to prevent idiots who don't know what they're doing from tampering with the mechanism. Top screw is the over travel stop. See how it's moving the trigger to the rear? If I have this screw adjusted too far, pulling the trigger, see, trigger can't move. I'm pulling it with my pinky down there. So, This screw is adjusted out until, okay, see the trigger just released? And I'm going to adjust it back in just a little bit to demonstrate that. See, I'm pulling the trigger and nothing's happening. That's because the trigger is stopped by the over travel screw. So this one you want to have adjusted just to the point, a little bit more, where it'll release. And then maybe a quarter turn further. After it releases, for it to still have just a hair of movement there. Alright. The bottom screw in the rear is your sear engagement. Looking in the window there, if I loosen it, I have to cock it again, demonstrate. Okay, there you go. Now you see how there's lots of sear engagement there. That's going to give you a lot of creep. As I pull the trigger, it's got to move that whole length before it lets go. So you want to adjust sear engagement. Start to where it's too much, and then with it cocked, there you go, tighten it until, about that much. I shoot for around 22 thousandths of an inch, which is the thickness of a box cutter blade. It releases, but if I were to put a scale on this trigger, my scale goes, oh wow, all the way up to 72 ounces before it releases. Now, I prefer it to release between 32 and 48 ounces. 40 ounces being my goal. That's for a sniper rifle. If you're carrying it around with you out in the field hunting, I think a 4-pound is a lot safer. Adjusting one of these triggers below 2 pounds is inherently unsafe for the mechanism. I prefer 2.5 pounds as my minimum. Some people are comfortable with 2. Anyway, what I'm going to do now is adjust the trigger pull. And I'm going to do that by loosening the bottom screw. Now, where the problem comes in is that the spring here is a very short and strong spring. So a small amount of adjustment will make a significant difference in the trigger pull weight. For example, right now I'm going to do a 1/2 turn. It dropped from 72 to just under 56 ounces by a half turn. Going to move it another half turn, and now it breaks at 2 pounds. Now I'm going to show you how to create the dangerous situation that was recently in the news as a hit piece on Remington triggers. I am going to unscrew this trigger another half turn. Alright, now the reason that it's easy to adjust the trigger improperly when you get to weights below 2 pounds is the actual friction of the sear on the trigger is just under 2 pounds. So if you took the spring out entirely, it would still be 2 pounds, or a little less, 1 3/4. Here's the problem. I have adjusted the trigger and it broke, a little bit under 2 pounds. What I've done basically is disengaged completely the spring that pushes the trigger back. When you put the weapon on safe, the sear and the trigger separate. There's no contact between the two. But also there's no pressure on the trigger to return it to the rear. So I'm going to pull the trigger. The trigger is now forward. Now I'm going to push the safety off, and the gun fires. Well, no duh, it fires, because there is no trigger involved in it. Fired again. But if I push the trigger forward and lower the hammer, then it doesn't fire. And then I pull the trigger by my finger, and it breaks nicely. So whenever you have the trigger manually pushed back forward, it operates normally. But if you keep the trigger to the rear, put the safety on, pull the trigger is now disengaged, take the safety off, and the gun fires. So the cure for this is simply don't adjust below its design parameters. So I want to have a trigger pull okay, that's 3 1/4. Gonna back it off. Just a hair, 1/4 turn. And you can see when I pull the trigger, it still snaps back on its own. Just over 2 1/2. Alright, so now I put the weapon on safe. Disengages the trigger from the sear, no contact at all. I pull the trigger, but when I let go, it snaps back because the spring is in contact. So then I put the weapon on fire, and it doesn't fire till I pull the trigger.